Officer Linda Carter had been a police officer for many years. She had seen many things, some good, some bad. But through it all, she always believed in helping people. She loved her job, especially when it meant keeping her community safe. Today was just another normal day, or at least, that's what she thought. The sun was shining brightly, and a cool breeze made the warm afternoon pleasant. Linda drove slowly through the neighborhood, watching people go about their day. Children laughed as they ran around the park, chasing each other. A few elderly people sat on their porches, enjoying the weather. Everything seemed peaceful, just as it should be. As she drove past a small grocery store, she noticed something unusual. A little boy stood near the entrance, looking around nervously. His clothes were a little messy, and his hair was uncombed. He looked as if he had been running, and his small hands were clenched into fists. There was something about the way he stood, so still, yet so anxious, that made Linda slow down. She parked her car and stepped out, adjusting her police belt. She was used to kids running up to her with questions or just to say hello, but this boy didn't look like he was here for fun. As soon as he saw her, his eyes widened with relief, and he ran straight toward her. Linda knelt down to his level, giving him a warm smile. "Hey there, buddy," she said softly. "Are you lost?" The boy shook his head quickly. His small chest rose and fell as he tried to catch his breath. He glanced behind him as if he was scared someone was following him. Linda noticed how his hands trembled, and a strange feeling settled in her stomach. Something wasn't right. "What's your name?" she asked gently. The boy hesitated, his lips pressing together tightly. He looked up at her with wide, teary eyes. Then he took a tiny step forward, leaned in close, and whispered 5 words into her ear. As soon as she heard them, Linda felt her breath catch. Her body tensed, and her heart pounded hard against her chest. The world around her seemed to blur for a moment. She had heard many things in her years as an officer, but nothing had ever made her feel like this. Her hands, steady just moments ago, now felt cold. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her emotions in check. She had to act fast. There was no time to waste. She placed her hands gently on the boy's shoulders and looked him straight in the eyes. "I need you to take me there, okay?" she said firmly but kindly. The boy nodded, wiping his eyes. Without another word, he turned and started running. Linda followed, her heart pounding with every step. She didn't know what she was about to walk into, but one thing was clear: this little boy needed her, and she wouldn't let him down. Linda's boots hit the pavement as she hurried after the little boy. He was small, but he ran fast, his tiny legs moving as quickly as they could. She could hear his short, panicked breaths as he led her through the quiet streets. The afternoon sun was still shining, but to Linda, everything suddenly felt darker, heavier. She didn't know exactly what she was walking into, but her gut told her it was serious. The boy's hands had been shaking, and his voice had been weak when he whispered those 5 words. It was a kind of fear she had seen before, the kind that meant something was very wrong. They turned a corner and came to a row of old apartment buildings. The boy ran up to the one with peeling paint and broken steps. He didn't stop at the entrance. Instead, he darted inside, taking 2 steps at a time. Linda was right behind him, her heartbeat quickening. The hallway smelled of dust and something stale, like no one had opened a window in days. The boy didn't hesitate. He rushed down the hall and stopped in front of a door. His small fists pounded on it, but there was no answer. "Mommy," he called, his voice breaking. "Mommy, wake up." Linda stepped forward, knocking firmly. "Police, is anyone inside?" she said loudly. Still, there was silence. The boy looked up at her, his eyes full of tears. "She's in there. She won't wake up." Linda didn't waste another second. She tried the doorknob, locked. Without thinking, she reached for her radio and called for backup and an ambulance. Then she stepped back, took a deep breath, and kicked the door hard near the handle. The old wood cracked, and with one more push it swung open. Inside, the room was dim, the curtains pulled shut. The air was thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. Linda's eyes quickly scanned the space, a small couch, a table with a few dishes, and then her heart dropped. On the worn-out couch, a woman lay still. Her face was pale, and her lips were slightly parted. Her dark hair covered part of her face, but she wasn't moving. Linda rushed forward, kneeling beside her. "Ma'am," she said urgently, shaking her gently. No response. She pressed 2 fingers to the woman's neck. There was a pulse, but it was weak. That was enough. She had a chance. "The ambulance is on the way," she told the boy, who stood frozen in the doorway. He clutched the edge of his shirt, his tiny body trembling. Tears slipped down his cheeks. "Please help her," he whispered. Linda grabbed her radio. "I have an unconscious female, weak pulse. Possible emergency. Need medics ASAP." The boy sniffled, stepping closer. Linda reached out, squeezing his small hand. "Listen to me," she said softly. "We're going to help her. You were very brave to find me." She meant every word. Without this little boy, his mother might not have had a chance. Now, all they could do was wait, and hope the ambulance would make it in time. Linda kept her hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling how small and fragile he was. His tiny fingers held onto her uniform tightly, as if he was afraid to let go. She could hear the sound of her own breathing, steady but tense. She had seen many emergencies before, but something about this one felt different. It wasn't just another call, it was personal now. The woman on the couch still wasn't moving. Linda carefully tilted her head back, checking her breathing. It was faint, but it was there. That meant there was still time. But how much? She didn't know. She looked around the apartment quickly, searching for any clue about what had happened. The room was small, with just a few pieces of furniture. A stack of bills sat on the table, some of them unopened. A few empty water bottles were on the floor. Nothing looked out of place, but something about it made her uneasy. The boy was staring at his mother, his eyes full of fear. He wiped his nose with his sleeve and looked up at Linda. "She won't wake up," he whispered. His voice was so soft, like he was afraid saying it louder would make it worse. Linda gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "We're going to help her, okay? The ambulance is coming." The boy nodded, but he didn't look reassured. He stayed close to her, watching as she moved toward the table. She didn't want to touch too much. This was an active situation, and she needed to let the paramedics handle it. But her eyes landed on something near the edge of the couch. A small notebook, the pages slightly crumpled. It looked like someone had been writing in it recently. Linda wasn't the type to invade someone's privacy, but in moments like these, any clue could be important. She glanced at the boy. "Do you know if your mommy was feeling sick?" she asked gently. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "She was very tired," he said. "She said she needed to rest." Linda's heart tightened. The way he said it, like he was repeating words he had heard many times before, made her stomach turn. A distant wail of sirens filled the air. Relief flooded her chest. Help was almost here. She turned back to the boy. "You did the right thing by coming to find me," she told him. "You're very brave." The boy didn't say anything. He just stared at his mother, his little hands gripping his shirt. Seconds later, the sound of rushing footsteps filled the hallway. The paramedics had arrived. Linda stepped aside as they hurried in with their equipment. The boy let go of her uniform for the first time since they had arrived. But he didn't step away. He just stood there, waiting. Linda stayed right beside him. No matter what happened next, she wasn't going to leave his side. The paramedics moved quickly, their hands working with practiced speed. One of them, a tall man with glasses, knelt beside the woman and checked her pulse again. The other paramedic, a woman with a kind face, pulled out medical equipment from the bag she carried. Linda stepped back slightly but kept her eyes on the boy. He was watching everything, his small body tense. His hands were still gripping the bottom of his shirt. twisting the fabric nervously. She could tell he didn't understand what was happening, only that something was very wrong. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" the male paramedic asked, gently shaking the woman's shoulder. There was no response. He turned to his partner. "Her pulse is weak. We need to move her now." The female paramedic nodded and started preparing an oxygen mask. She looked over at Linda. "Do we know how long she's been like this?" Linda shook her head. "I just got here. The boy found me outside. He said she wouldn't wake up." The female paramedic glanced at the child, her expression softening for a brief second before she turned back to work. The boy tugged at Linda's sleeve. "Is she going to be okay?" His voice was small, almost lost in the room full of busy movement. Linda crouched down beside him. "They're doing everything they can. Your mommy is strong," she said, hoping her words would bring him some comfort. He nodded, but his eyes stayed locked on his mother. The paramedics carefully lifted the woman onto a stretcher. As they strapped her in, the boy suddenly took a step forward. "Wait," he cried. "I need to go with her." Linda caught his hand gently before he could get too close. "You can come with me, sweetheart. We'll follow the ambulance, okay?" Tears welled in his eyes, but he nodded. He didn't argue, maybe because he was too tired or too scared. The paramedics wheeled the stretcher out of the apartment, moving quickly but carefully. Linda picked up the boy, holding him securely as they stepped outside. The moment they reached the street, the bright flashing lights of the ambulance filled their vision. The back doors swung open, and the paramedics carefully lifted the stretcher inside. One of them climbed in beside the woman, placing a monitor on her finger and adjusting the oxygen mask. The boy whimpered, his fingers digging into Linda's uniform. She could feel his little heart pounding fast against her own chest. "I want my mommy," he whispered. Linda hugged him tighter. "I know, buddy. We're going to stay with her, okay? We won't leave her alone." The ambulance doors closed, and the sirens wailed as it sped off toward the hospital. Linda carried the boy to her patrol car, buckling him in the front seat. Then, without wasting another second, she started the engine and followed the flashing lights ahead. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let this boy go through this alone. Linda kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting gently on the boy's small shoulder. She could feel how tense he was, his tiny body stiff as he watched the flashing ambulance lights ahead of them. He hadn't spoken much since they left the apartment, and Linda understood why. His whole world had just turned upside down. The sirens echoed through the streets as they sped toward the hospital. Linda drove carefully but quickly, her mind racing with thoughts. She had seen many emergencies before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about doing her job. It was about this little boy sitting next to her, scared and unsure of what would happen next. She glanced at him. His hands were clasped together tightly, resting on his lap. His eyes, wide and filled with worry, never left the ambulance ahead. "She's going to be okay, right?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Linda took a deep breath before answering. "The doctors are going to do everything they can. Your mommy is in good hands." He nodded, but he didn't look convinced. He stayed quiet for a long moment before speaking again. "I don't want to be alone." Linda's heart squeezed at his words. She gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You're not alone, buddy. I'm right here with you." The hospital came into view, its bright lights glowing against the evening sky. As they pulled into the emergency entrance, Linda saw the paramedics already rushing the stretcher inside. She parked the car quickly, then unbuckled the boy's seatbelt. "Come on, let's go see how your mommy is doing," she said. He hesitated for just a second, then reached up, taking Linda's hand. Together, they walked through the hospital doors, stepping into the brightly lit waiting area. The air smelled of medicine and disinfectant, and the quiet hum of voices filled the space. A nurse spotted them and hurried over. "Are you with the woman they just brought in?" she asked. Linda nodded. "Yes, this is her son." The nurse knelt down, giving the boy a warm smile. Your mommy is with the doctors right now, sweetheart. They're taking good care of her. The boy's fingers tightened around Linda's hand. Can I see her? The nurse's smile softened. Not yet, but I promise we'll let you know as soon as you can. Linda led the boy to a chair in the waiting area and sat beside him. His legs dangled off the seat, his small hands still gripping hers. The minutes passed slowly, each second feeling longer than the last. Linda stayed right by his side, knowing that, no matter what happened next, she would be there for him. They just had to wait. And hope. The hospital waiting room was quiet except for the soft murmurs of nurses and the occasional beeping of machines in the distance. The boy sat close to Linda, his small hands still gripping hers. His legs swung slightly over the edge of the chair, but his eyes never left the big doors where his mother had been taken. Linda could feel the tension in his tiny body. He hadn't said much since they arrived. He was waiting, just like her, hoping for good news. A nurse walked past them, glancing at the boy with a kind smile before disappearing behind the doors. Linda knew the hospital staff was doing everything they could, but the waiting was the hardest part. The boy took a shaky breath. What if she doesn't wake up? He whispered. Linda's heart ached at his words. She turned to him, her voice gentle but firm. Your mommy is strong. She's fighting, and the doctors are helping her. We have to be strong for her too, okay? He nodded slowly, but Linda could see the fear in his eyes. He was too young to understand everything, but he knew enough to be scared. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. Linda kept glancing at the clock, hoping a doctor would walk through the doors at any moment with news. She knew the boy was exhausted. His small body slumped against her, and his eyelids drooped. She reached over, brushing his messy hair back. Do you want to rest for a little while? I'll wake you up as soon as we hear something. The boy shook his head. I don't want to sleep. I want to see my mommy. Linda understood. He was afraid that if he closed his eyes, something bad might happen. She had seen that fear before in people waiting for news about their loved ones. She couldn't promise him everything would be okay, but she could be there for him. Just then, the doors swung open, and a doctor walked toward them. Linda straightened, her grip on the boy's hand tightening slightly. The doctor stopped in front of them, offering a small, tired smile. She's stable, he said gently. Linda let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The boy sat up straighter, his eyes wide with hope. Can I see her? He asked quickly. The doctor knelt down so he was at the boy's level. She's still very weak, and she needs to rest. But yes, you can see her for a little while. Tears welled up in the boy's eyes, but this time, they weren't just from fear. Linda stood, holding his hand as they followed the doctor through the doors. As they walked down the quiet hallway, she glanced down at the little boy. His steps were small, but his heart was big. He had been so brave through all of this. Now he was finally going to see his mother again. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of a heart monitor. The soft glow of a small lamp lit up the space, casting gentle shadows on the walls. Linda stepped inside with the little boy, their footsteps light against the cold floor. His grip on her hand tightened as he saw his mother lying on the hospital bed. She looked pale, her eyes closed, and an oxygen mask covered part of her face. Wires and tubes were connected to her arms, helping the doctors monitor her condition. The boy hesitated for a second, then let go of Linda's hand and slowly walked toward the bed. His small fingers gripped the side rail tightly. "Mommy," he whispered. There was no answer. The boy's lower lip trembled, and he blinked quickly as tears filled his eyes. Linda placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "She's resting," she said gently. "The doctor said she needs time to get better." The boy sniffled and wiped his face with the sleeve of his shirt. Then, very carefully, he reached through the rail and took his mother's hand. "I found help, Mommy," he said softly. "I got a police officer, just like you always told me to." Linda felt her throat tighten. She had seen a lot in her years as an officer, but something about this little boy's strength touched her heart deeply. He had been scared, but he had done the right thing. And now he just wanted his mother to wake up. Minutes passed in silence, the steady beeping of the monitor the only sound in the room. The boy didn't let go of his mother's hand. He just sat there, waiting, hoping. Then there was a small movement. The boy gasped, his eyes widening. Linda saw it too. His mother's fingers twitched slightly. "Mommy," the boy whispered again, hope filling his voice. Slowly, the woman's eyelids fluttered open. Her eyes were heavy and unfocused at first, but then they landed on the small figure beside her. A weak smile appeared on her lips. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The boy let out a small sob, this time one of relief. "You're awake," he cried, squeezing her hand gently. Linda watched as the woman tried to lift her hand but was too weak. She turned her gaze toward Linda, confusion and gratitude in her tired eyes. Linda gave her a small nod. "Your little boy is very brave," she said softly. "He ran to find help when you needed it the most." The woman's eyes filled with tears, and she looked back at her son. "You saved me," she whispered. The boy sniffled, nodding quickly. "I love you, Mommy." A tear rolled down her cheek as she whispered back, "I love you too." Linda stepped back, giving them a moment. The worst was over. Now, there was hope. The boy stayed close to his mother, still holding her hand tightly. His small fingers gently traced over her skin, as if he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. Even though she was weak, she squeezed his hand back, her touch light but full of love. Linda stood near the door, watching the quiet moment between them. She had seen the little boy's strength, his fear, and now his relief. He had done something truly brave, something most children his age wouldn't have known how to do. The doctor stepped inside, checking the woman's monitors and vitals. "You're very lucky," he told her gently. "Your son found help just in time." The woman looked at her boy, tears shining in her tired eyes. "I am lucky," she whispered, "because of him." The boy smiled a little, but he still looked worried. "Are you going to be okay now, Mommy?" The doctor nodded. "She needs to rest and get stronger, but she will be okay." Hearing those words, the boy finally let out a deep breath, as if he had been holding it in for hours. He laid his head on the edge of the bed, still holding his mother's hand, and closed his eyes for the first time since that night began. Linda felt a sense of peace wash over her. The fear that had filled the air earlier was now replaced with warmth, love, and hope. The woman turned her eyes to Linda, her voice weak but full of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being there for him, for me." Linda gave her a kind smile. "He's the real hero," she said, glancing down at the boy. He knew exactly what to do. The woman brushed a hand over her son's hair, her fingers shaking but full of love. "I don't know what I would have done without him." The doctor finished checking the monitors and looked at Linda. "She'll need to stay for a few days, but she's stable. That's the most important thing." Linda nodded, feeling a deep sense of relief. She looked at the little boy, who was now breathing softly, his body finally relaxing. He had carried the weight of the world on his tiny shoulders that night, but now he could rest. As she turned to leave, the woman called out, "Officer." Linda stopped, looking back. The woman's voice was still weak, but her words were strong. "I won't forget this. Thank you for keeping my son safe." Linda smiled. "He's the one who kept you safe." She gave one last glance at the boy, sleeping peacefully beside his mother, and walked out into the quiet hallway. Tonight had been hard, but it had also been proof that love and courage could change everything. And she knew, without a doubt, that this little boy had saved a life. Not just his mother's, but his own as well.